Hope everybody had a good week. So many people on spring breaks, aren't there? I mean, all kinds of spring breaks going on. So people are in and out of the church a lot. And maybe you've already had your spring break. How many of you have already been out? You've been somewhere? Anybody? Any of you? All of you? Okay. How many of you still have spring break coming? A couple of you? Okay. All right, well, maybe you're jacked up and excited about that. I hope you are. Get a little break from class and school and teachers and homework and papers and everything else. Okay, well, most of us, no matter what culture we're from, we're avid movie watchers. Most of you watch movies of some kind, and you're all familiar with what's called the sequel, okay? Everybody know what a sequel is? Yeah, it's kind of like part two of something. And, many movie makers make an attempt at doing sequels. They do well at the box office, or, a movie of some kind is really popular. And so, it's like, well, let's do that again. Let's do part two, or let's try to continue the story. And so, I've tried to do a little research on this. We try to relate to everybody here. And the longer we go here with M2, the more of a mix we get. We got younger people, and then younger people, and then we have those who are more experienced and more middle-aged, a little further down in the journey of life. And so then we have various cultures here, and so we try to reach out to everybody here in the service. And so doing a little research, every culture has its own movies and dramas, the K-dramas. How many of you watch K-dramas? Korean dramas? Anybody watch those? Okay. I think some of you do. One of the most popular ones, I think, is I noticed that in doing some research, the K-dramas, they sort of carry a theme, don't they? Like each year, like 2013, 2014 has a theme they carry over sometimes. One of the themes was time travel, okay? Yeah, so I don't know. Hope I'm right. And so, they're trying to continue the story. And so that's what we're going to do this morning, is we're going to continue the story. Last week, if you were here, we talked about this superhero guy. His name is Elijah, okay? Elijah is one of the superheroes of the Old Testament. And so he's a little bit like RoboCop, okay? He comes in and saves the day and, just bashes out these 450 false prophets of Ahab and Jezebel. And so Elijah stands up as this great hero, okay? He's, like I said last week, he's on the top of his game. And then something happens to him. This woman comes in, the king's wife, Jezebel. She comes in and makes one comment to him, one derogatory comment. It's not an observation. It's not even a criticism of any kind. It's actually a threat. And she makes this threat against Elijah, and it just absolutely crushes him. Now again, let's try to get into his world just for a moment, okay? Because Elijah, remember, he's on the top of his game, and all of a sudden this threat from this lady, this Jezebel, comes. She makes this threat to him and just crushes his life, just tears him down, okay? He goes to a place, Elijah goes to a place in his life where some of us find ourselves. And it's those moments in our lives when those threats almost seem to destroy us. Many of us, at some moment in our lives, we live under the threat of something. And so when we look at Elijah's life, we can relate to him in the sense that there has been, or will be, or maybe already has taken place in your life, a threat of some kind that has kind of taken you down a little bit. It's destroyed you. It's taken your joy away from you. It's changed your demeanor in some way. Maybe it's even changed your outlook in life or your direction. I don't know. But we can all relate to Elijah in some way or another. And this morning, I think, as we unpack his story again, we see where God wants to encourage us that no matter where we find ourselves in these threats of life, or no matter how far down we might get, or we get not only out of the game, we get off the game, that God says that we can continue the story. And today we're going to finish up this whole in the middle of it series that we've been doing for several weeks now. We're going to finish this up today talking about moving on. Because no matter where you're at in your journey this morning, I want to encourage you to move on, okay? Now, you may be where Elijah's at. You might be discouraged. Maybe you're a little disappointed in the way things are turning out. Maybe you feel overwhelmed today. Remember, last week I talked about there's times in our lives when things are going on, guys, that we just can't understand. We don't have answers to. Maybe you're praying your heart out and God just seems to be distant or quiet or aloof. And even in those moments, God's trying to encourage us to always move on with our lives. And that's what he's doing with Elijah here. The story's not over. There's more to tell about Elijah. In fact, if you're not familiar with this story, let me encourage you at some point to take your Bible or your iPhone, wherever you have the scriptures, and read 1 Kings chapter 19. And you look at the story of Elijah because it's one of the most powerful stories of a man's life in the Old Testament. And there's so many rich truths in there and so many things that each one of us can relate to. And that's why we're taking a second look at it this morning in the sequel of Elijah's story, okay? Because it didn't end last week. Now, I said a moment ago, you and I get in those places sometimes where we're living under the threat of something, okay? Maybe it's the threat of deadlines, it's the threat of finances, it's the threat of the people around you. Some of you who are a little bit older this morning, you may feel threatened on your jobs, okay? Everybody's kind of on the edge now, on the edge of their seat wondering, am I going to have a job next year? Am I going to have a job next month? Some of you who are going to college right now and you're preparing for your future, you're wondering, are you even going to have a job, okay? And it's something that everyone worries about and is anxious over at some point in their life. And so we all live under these threats of something. And in those times when we live in those threats, there also comes the moment that we have to simply start over, and that's where Elijah is. You see, God is going to move into Elijah's life in this story this morning, and God is going to help Elijah start over. Because Elijah had got to the place where he had just given up. He had sort of shut down, and Elijah had kind of quit and threw in the towel, so to speak. And God's moving back into Elijah's life in a fresh new way, and he's encouraging him that, hey, you've got to get up and start over. You've got to get up and move on. And so every one of us can relate to that in some way or another. It's you know what that's called? It's called your sequel. You see, sometimes things happen in your life, in you and around you, in your control, out of your control, and they just sort of cause you just to kind of shut down a little bit. And God's kind of saying, listen, this is not the end of your story. There's a sequel. And each new day as we get up, as every one of us get up and start a new week and a new day and a new month and a new year, we are moving into our sequels. You see, it's not the end of the story. No matter what's happening with you or not happening with you at this very moment, God is saying you have a sequel. It's not the end of the story. There's a part 2 and a part 3. We used to teach people back years ago when anybody seen the movie Jaws? About the shark, we used to see, there's Jaws 1, 2, 3, and we used to say there's going to be a Jaws 15, okay, and that's kind of like RoboCop, isn't it? RoboCop 1, 2, and 7, and 10, and 14, okay, they just keep pumping away those sequels as long as we can, or as long as they can, and that's what God is saying about our lives sometimes. You have to keep pumping out the sequels. You have to keep starting over. Because every one of us will have moments in our lives when you have to start over. You've got to get up and you've got to start over. You have to move on. And maybe you're there today to move on. Is God speaking to you about moving on? About getting out of those threats, about getting out of those caves that we find ourselves sometimes like Elijah and just simply moving on into your sequel? Remember last week when we talked about Elijah for a few minutes and we said, I said Elijah at this point in his life wasn't on the top of his game. In fact, at this point in Elijah's life, Elijah wasn't even in the game. Remember, he'd been benched, suspended, quit, on leave of something, whatever you want to call it. Elijah was just gone. And God was trying to get deep into the spirit of Elijah's heart. Because you see, guys, here's what's going on in this story. God did not see Elijah the way Elijah saw Elijah. Now, I want you to take a look at your own life this morning because you see yourself in some way. And I'm not talking about just a reflection of your appearance. I mean, deep down in the spirit of who you are today, you see yourself in some way. And there are times when we see ourselves and it's not all that we want it to be. It's not all that we had planned. And we look at ourselves and it's like, man, I don't know. This isn't turning out the way I want it to. And you just sort of feel like giving up or shutting down or something. And God's saying, listen, I don't see you the way you see you. I see you totally different. And that's what he was saying to Elijah. I see you different than you see you most of the time. And Elijah was trying to move into the depths of, God was trying to move into the depths of Elijah's heart because he had a sequel for him to live out, just like he does you and me. You see, sometimes, guys, when we get under these threats of life, you know what happens to us? We get stuck. Have you ever felt stuck? I mean, it's like, man, I'm just stuck. I can't go here, I can't go there, this isn't happening, that's not happening, I feel stuck. And we get hung up sometimes on finding the answers to everything. Now you'll notice in this story, if you've ever read it, and we don't have time to read the whole story this morning, but you'll find that Elijah is in this cave. You see, he's retreated to this cave. This great warrior who just defeated all these false prophets of Baal. You know what Elijah did? He retreated. In other words, he ran and he hid himself in this cave. And so Elijah obviously wasn't on the top of his game. And Elijah, he wasn't looking for answers. Read the story. Not one time will you see that Elijah was like, God, give me the answers. Why is this happening? Elijah had just shut down. And guys, listen. If you've ever been in a place in your life where you felt stuck, one of the things that you have to caution yourself against is this. You have to caution yourself against getting stuck. Just getting stuck. You know what that means when we get stuck in these things? It means that we're not moving. It means that we're not going forward, we're not going backward, we're not going anywhere. We're not focusing on anything. We've just kind of lost it. Let me give you something I want you to think about today, and you may want to write this down in your bulletin as a note or something. I try to give you these little key things each week to, so we can all have something that kind of impacts us a little bit. We've been talking about being in the middle of things. Remember, life sometimes it's like, man, I'm just kind of stuck in the middle. Well, I want you to think about this, if you will. You see, there comes a time in many of our lives when we have too much of God to go back and not enough of God to go forward. Let's put that slide up, if you will, guys, so people can write that down if they'd like. You see, we have too much of God to go back and not enough to go forward, and I think that's where Elijah was. That he had so much of God that he couldn't go backward. You ever felt like that? It's like, man, I can't go back to what I used to be. I can't go back and do those things. I can't go back and live that way. I've reached this point in my life with God. And then it's like I've got so much of God, though, or I don't have enough of God to move forward. I need more of God to move forward. I've got so much I can't go back, but I don't have enough to go forward. You know what that's called? In the middle. In the middle. And that's where Elijah was. He was stuck in the middle of this cave. Elijah was in the middle of it. And he couldn't go back. He had too much of God. But he's like, I can't go forward either because I need more. And that's where he was at. And sometimes you and I will find ourselves in that same place. Man, I can't go back to what I used to be. But God, I need your help and I need your strength to go forward because I'm stuck. I'm in the middle. And let me tell you a couple of things about being in the middle. When you're in the middle, you feel like you're halfway between two places. Halfway between two places. It means you're stuck somewhere and you can't go backwards. You don't want to go back. There's nothing to go back to. And you're stuck in the middle and it's like, I want to go forward, but I don't know where to go. I don't know how to get there and I can't go on my own. I'm stuck in the middle. And that's one of the most powerful things I believe that we see in Elijah's life is that Elijah had retreated to this cave where he thought was a safe place away from all the threats of life and realized, hey, wait a minute, I can't go back to what I used to be and I certainly can't go forward. I'm stuck in the middle. You know what stuck in the middle means? It means no motion. That you're not going anywhere. You're not moving forward. You're not going backwards. You're stuck in the middle. You're not going anywhere. There's no progress. There's no moving forward. There's no nothing. You're right in the middle of it, going nowhere. And that's where Elijah was. Man, there's so much about this guy's life, guys, that we can relate to at some point in our own journey. Stuck in this cave in the middle, going nowhere, but knew that there was somewhere to go. Remember last week when I talked about this, that sometimes we find ourselves here and we know that we need to be there. Remember that? And we got to get from here to there. And so many times we find ourselves here and we know there's a there, but it's like, how do I get there? What is there? Where is there? And that's where Elijah, you see, God knew that there was a there for Elijah. He knew that Elijah at this point in his life was here, but that's not where Elijah could stay. He needed to go there, and he needed God's help to get there. And so do I, and so do you sometimes. Let's go to the Bible just for a moment. There's 3 really simple things I want to point out here this morning, and that's don't go there, get out, and go forward. You know, 1 Kings chapter 19, there's 2 verses there, verses 9 and 13. I want you to look at those real quick, if you will. Man, I wish we had time to just really, I wish we had about an hour or so to go through this story. There's just so much here. And, we try to unpack it as quick as we can on Sunday mornings with the time frame that we have to work in. And I want you to notice 2 different times in verses 9 and verse 13. I want you to notice what God said to Elijah. Remember, he's in the cave. He has retreated to the cave. He's hiding out. He's stuck. He's in the middle of it. He's not sure where to go. And God says to him 2 times, Elijah, what are you doing here? Twice God says that to him. Now I want you to notice something very important about the way that's written. God didn't say, Elijah, what are you doing there? He said, Elijah, what are you doing here? You know what that means? That means that God wasn't there and Elijah was here. That means that God was right there with him. Elijah, what are you doing here? You see, no matter when you and I get stuck, we find ourselves in the cave, we're in the middle of something and we don't know, we can't go back and we can't go forward. We can always have the confidence of knowing that no matter where you find yourself, God will be right there with you. He'll always be right there with you. And God is saying to Elijah, he asks him that question 2 different times. Now remember, Elijah, he didn't ask any questions. God was asking the questions. You ever think about this sometimes? We often come to God and we have all these questions. Who? What? The biggest one is when? How? We ask all these questions to God, and God's just sitting there like he's allowing us to ask these questions. And then there are times when God asks us the questions. And that's what he's doing with Elijah here. Elijah, what are you doing here? Now, have you noticed look at that chapter, if you will. I want you to notice what Elijah does immediately after God asks him that question. Elijah starts making excuses. You know what he does? He starts telling God all the reasons why he's in the cave. Well, God's like, Elijah, what are you doing here? And Elijah's making up all these excuses like, well, God, here's why I'm in the cave. All these things have happened. Nobody likes me. I'm all by myself. Nobody's gone through what I've gone through. You ever heard those questions? You ever ask those? You ever say those things to yourself? Well, nobody's been where I've been. Nobody understands me. I'm all alone. Nobody else has ever been through this. You ever ask yourself or say that to yourself? Some of you are looking at me like, I have, but I don't want to admit it. We've all asked those questions, guys, because that's the reality of life. Sometimes we get to those places and it's like, man, I feel so alone. I'm surrounded by people, but I feel alone. And Elijah was saying, God, here's why I'm in the cave. Look at it. Let me read it to you real quick. You see, Elijah replied to God and said, I've been very zealous for the Lord Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, broken down your altars, and put your prophets to death with a sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. I mean, there's excuses plastered all over that, isn't there? Reasons why I'm in the cave. And when you find yourself in the cave, sometimes instead of finding a way out, we try to justify why we're in. And God is saying, listen, I get it, okay, Elijah? I understand. There's nothing about you that I haven't seen. I've heard it all. And I get that. But that's not the end of your story. God wants to move him forward. And so I believe that God is saying to Elijah, don't go there. You see, Elijah is justifying why I'm there, making all these excuses. And God's like, yeah. And Elijah's like, yeah, but. Guys, I know one thing in my own life. We're kind of like Elijah sometimes, and we're like, we give God all these yeah buts, don't we? Yeah but. And I know sometimes in my own life, sometimes you have to get off your yeah buts, don't you? You do. And that's what God was trying to do, is he's trying to get Elijah off of his yeah buts and move forward and get out of there. Remember that phrase, everybody says that, don't go there. In other words, that's a place that I don't want to visit. And I believe that's what God was saying to Elijah. Elijah, you're in the cave, and you and I both understand how you got here, but this is not a place where you want to be. And I think that's what God says to us sometimes. You see, we go places, guys, in our minds and our hearts, and even with our bodies, our legs and our arms take us there. And we go places in our lives that we don't want to be, that God doesn't want us to be, and we find ourselves there. And God's like, I understand all the reasons, all the ways that you got here. I get that, but that's not where you want to be. That's not where you want to stay. Don't go there. And I think that's what God was saying to Elijah. The second thing I believe he was telling him is this, and I believe we can all relate to this as well, that we have to get out. If you look in verse 19 of the same chapter, we've all heard this so many times. Those of you who are even younger, you've heard this in Sunday school over and over, this part of Elijah's story. Elijah has made up all these excuses why he's in the cave, why he retreated there, all the stuff that's going on in his life. And then God begins to do something miraculous and powerful in Elijah's life, guys. And you know what? Every time we find ourselves in these places where God doesn't want us to be, you know what? Those are the same places we don't want to be. And God begins to do something powerful in our lives. He does. And it may not be this miraculous thing, even if it's something very small. God is doing something in every one of our lives this very moment to get us where he wants us to be. And that's what he was doing with Elijah. Now let's look at this real quick together, okay? You see, the Lord told Elijah, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. You know what, man, I'm just simple enough to believe this. I'm simple enough to believe that God is working around me all the time, and he's always passing by in and through my life every day. I just believe that, just that simple. I may not be able to see God, I may not hear him verbally, but I just believe that God's always around us. God is about to pass by. He tells that to Elijah. Now look, you've seen this part of the story where all these things happen, these miraculous weather things, okay? And we've all experienced much of that this year, haven't we? The snow, the rain. What kind of weather is that, guys, when it snows one day and it's 75 the next? That's out of control, isn't it? That's weird, okay? And then the mudslides, the earthquakes, everything going on now. And then in Elijah's moment in his journey here, God is like, he sends this wind. In fact, the Bible describes it as a powerful, great and powerful wind. And you know what? Look what it says, that wind was so powerful it tore the mountains. It tore them. And then it says this, and the Lord was not in the wind. Now put yourself in Elijah's place this morning. You're looking for God. You're trying to get out of the cave. You want to move forward. And all of a sudden, what you think is this big thing comes along in your life. And it's like, man, God's speaking in this big thing, this wind. And that may have been what Elijah thought. And then the Bible says, but God wasn't in the wind. All right, let's try something else. And after the wind, there was an earthquake. And then this big earthquake comes. And all of a sudden, the earth is shaking. And then it's like, man, that must be God. And we look at Elijah's story, and it says, but God was not in the earthquake. And it's like, all right, he's not in the wind, he's not in the earthquake. And then all of a sudden a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And then after that, I think, comes the most awesome thing, that God was in the gentle whisper. Now, here's a couple things I think we need to take note when we read this story. You see, God was leading Elijah to the place where he could experience him like he had never experienced him before. And you see, I think that's what God's doing in all of our lives, because God, the Holy Spirit of God, is actively involved in our lives every day, guys. He's actively involved in your life right now. And oftentimes when we want God to show up, or when we think God's going to do something, you know what we look for? We look for God in the big things. We look for God in the powerful wind. We look for God in the shaking earthquake. We look for God in the burning fire. And it's like, God, if you're going to show up, I'm just looking for you to show up in this big, miraculous way. This powerful way that just comes in and just slams into my life. And I think one thing that we can learn from Elijah is this, is that sometimes God shows up in the whispers. In the whispers. Now, guys, folks, listen. So often we look for God in the big things. You might be looking for God in the big things right now, the big stuff. You know, if God's going to show up in my life, he's going to do something big. Big. God's going to do something big. And we pray for it, and we look for it, and we watch for God to do something big and huge and miraculous and powerful. And you know what? Sometimes he does. But sometimes we get so focused on God doing something big, you know what happens? We miss God doing something little. As I read the New Testament, as I read the Old Testament, I find God showing up sometimes in the small things as much as he does the big things. And you know what happens? We miss him. You know why we miss him? It's because we're looking for the big thing. You see, we live in a culture, guys, and it doesn't matter whether we're from America or Korea or China or Thailand or where we're from this morning, we look for the big things. You know why? It's because we think that equates God. We think if God's going to show up, it's big. If it's big, it must be God. God could never be in the small things. Why? Because he's a big God. And sometimes God will show up in the small things. You know what we need to allow God to do more than what we allow him to? We need to allow God to do it his way more than we do. And God was showing up in a way that Elijah wasn't expecting. Not in the big things, but in the small things. I'm going to give you three things. Mother Teresa, whatever you think about her, Mother Teresa always said this, that small things done with great love would change the world. Small things done with great love would change the world. You guys know I read a lot of leadership stuff, and there's a guy, his name is Tim Elmore, that works with John Maxwell, and Tim Elmore has a tape, a leadership tape, and the title of the leadership tape is this: More time spent with less people equals a greater kingdom impact. And the whole tape is about spending more of your time with a smaller group of people, because that's where you're going to make a greater kingdom impact. Now listen, I've been doing church since I was younger than you guys. And I've watched church change in the last 30 years. The church, in 1976, you know what size a big church was? 250 people. That was a huge church in 1976. And now there's 7, 8, 10, 12,000 people. Now let me tell you something. Some of you like this, some of you won't, but it's the truth. Just because there's a large crowd doesn't mean there's a big God. You see, church, we can do church growth stuff, but it doesn't mean that that's where God is. I really believe with all my heart that God's doing some of the greatest work in the smallest churches. I really do. With all my heart, I believe that. Did you know that if you read the things that Jesus taught us, Jesus never taught us to go after the big things. He said, leave the 99 and go after the one. That's what he said. And he also said this. He said, if you've done this to the least of these, you've done it to me. He didn't say if you go after the biggest crowd, then that's where I'm the most happy. He said, if you do it to the least of these, then you've actually done it unto me. You see, sometimes we have to do a 180 with the way we see God. And it's not this Western American successful version of things. It's God's version. And God's version sometimes is so different than ours. And God was showing up in Elijah's life in a whisper. In a whisper. And sometimes God will show up in your life in a whisper. In the smallest things in your life. And what we have to caution ourselves with is this, guys. Because we're not looking for the small things, we miss them. We miss it because we're focused on the big thing. And we miss the small thing, which is actually the big thing. I think that's maybe the most powerful thing about this man's story, is that God showed himself powerful in the smallest thing, a whisper. How many of you respond when somebody's talking to you or trying to tell you something? Do you respond to people who are like, come here, Miss Sweet. She didn't know I was going to do this. If you didn't mind doing that, I would really appreciate it. Okay? Mm-hmm. All right. Now come here. How many of you would respond positive to that? Or it's like, listen, how many times have I told you? Okay, now which one are you going to respond to the most positive? We all know the answer to that, don't we? And we think God's like, pounding away at us. And sometimes it's just that little whisper. It's like, hey, I love you. Hey, would you mind? And we think God's after us all the time. God's mad at us. God's trying to correct us and punish us. And sometimes he does, guys. But I will tell you that that's really not the biggest part of God's character. It's really not. And God was coming to Elijah in this voice. You see, what's funny is he wasn't in these other things were only to get Elijah's attention so that he could actually hear God. Can I ask you a question this morning that I really want you to think about? Is God doing something to get your attention? Is God doing something in your life right now to get your attention? And if he is, what is he doing? Is he doing something loud? Hey, you, come here. Is God doing something loud in your life? Or is he saying, would you? What's God doing? Sometimes it's those softest, gentlest whispers where God's doing something to get our attention. I guarantee you God's doing something to get all of our attention today, including me. And oftentimes it's not what we think. And that's what he was doing, Elijah. So he was telling Elijah, look, Elijah, you're stuck in this cave. You're not going anywhere. You've got to get out of there. And sometimes we find ourselves in that same place. Listen, it's like, man, I'm in this place in my life, and I got to get out. I can't go back. I can't go forward. I'm here, and I need to be there, and I got to get out of here. And that's what God was trying to do with Elijah, is get him out of there. There's always this one place that we have to get out of. And I've been there more times than I want to think. Pastor Ron has been in some places that he needed to get out of at times. Yep, Pastor Ron. Yep, he's just a real guy. Yeah. And he's been in places that he needed to get out of sometimes. Now that doesn't mean that I was in a place where, I've never been anywhere that I wouldn't care for any of you to see me, okay? So, we'll just kind of straighten that out. But there's been places in my life that I needed to get out of, just like you. You know what those places are called? I'm going to tell you. Here's what those places are called. The place God doesn't want you to be. That's what it's called. The place God doesn't want you to be. And that's where Elijah was. He was in this cave. And God said, that's not where I want you to be, Elijah. And he begins to speak to him. You know what he does, guys? He gave Elijah the same thing that he gives you and me. Here's what it is: an invitation. An invitation. God is always inviting us somewhere. He's always actively involved in the world. He's actively involved around you right now in ways that you may not be able to see or feel or hear, but he's in your life right now, working around you, and he's inviting you into the things that he's involved in, inviting you to come, inviting you to be a part of that. Now that's a scary word in church. When we hear the word invitation in church, we we start sliding down in our seats, okay? It's like, okay, here it comes. And that's not what it's about. God was inviting Elijah to come out of the cave, and God's inviting you to do the same thing, as well as myself. Because he's always doing something to draw us into his presence. Invited. Now, I don't know about you, but how many of you have ever gone somewhere? Anybody, I mean, how many of you guys, there's been like this place, like maybe a gathering, a social gathering or a party or something, and you were kind of all jacked up about going, and every day goes by and the time for the party gets here and you're still looking in the mailbox, you're still looking at your emails, you're trying to see if your phone's still working. You know why? Because you didn't get an invitation. And it's like, man, I wish I could go, but I didn't get invited. And something that we all have to come to grips with sometimes is this: you can't go where you're not invited. And if you do, you know what that's called? A crash. And nobody wants to crash a party. Nobody wants to go where they're not invited, okay? And God's always inviting you somewhere in your life. He's inviting you to get involved, to be where he's at, to be a part of who he is. God wasn't in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire, but he was there. He was in the gentle whisper, not the big stuff. And Elijah was still in the cave. Did you see that the second time? Remember, look at that once again, if you don't mind. In verse 13, at the bottom of verse 13, God has to ask again, Elijah, what are you doing here? Because he had already spoken to him in this gentle little whisper. What are you doing here? And then you know what? Look at what Elijah does. He makes the same excuses. Well, I told you this is why I'm here, God. And then God begins to draw him into the real important thing here. And we don't have time to read it, but I want you to look at it. Because God says something to Elijah. He says, go back. Look at verse, what is it? Look at verse 15. Go back the way you came. Now this is a different go back than I talked about earlier. Sometimes we can't go back. We don't need to go back or even want to go back to where we used to be. But now God's telling Elijah to go back where he came from for a reason, okay? Because sometimes we find ourselves in this place away from God where we need to go back. We need to. And guys, listen, in my own life, there's been times when I needed to get back with God. Get back with him. Go back where my and his relationship was where it used to be. And that's where that's where God's trying to take Elijah. Go back the way you came because you're missing something. Missing it. A friend of mine and I used to say this to each other. We used to encourage each other, actually. One of my greatest fears, and his too, his name's Chris, we used to talk about one of the greatest fears that we had in this life was for God to have something for us on our journey and miss it. To miss it. And we both used to talk about that a lot. Man, I just don't want to miss anything God has. I don't want to miss something God may have in my journey or something God has planned for my life. I don't want to miss that. And you see, God didn't want Elijah to miss what he had planned for him. Remember when Elijah was saying, you know, God, I'm in the cave and all this has happened and I'm all by myself and nobody cares and I'm here all by myself and I'm all alone. And remember when he was saying that? Read it. And God, here's what God's doing in Elijah's life the rest of that section. No, you're not alone. Not only am I with you, but I've already prepared an army for you. You think, Elijah, you think all these guys around you, you think they've gone off and torn down altars and they've worshiped other gods? No, you're missing something here. You're missing the fact that, no, there are guys waiting and ready to go to war. Now look at what God says. You read it for yourself. You don't have to take my word for everything. You read it for yourself. God says, he says, I have reserved these men. Read it sometime. And I want to point out to you guys this morning that God did not say, I will reserve these men. He said, I have reserved these men. You know what he's telling Elijah? I've already got this set up for you. This is not something I'm going to do, Elijah. This is something I've already done. And I'm trying to draw you into this so that you don't miss it. That's what he's telling him. But you've got to get out of the cave. You've got to get up. You've got to move forward. You can't go back. And that's what he was saying to him. I can relate to that. I don't know about you guys, but I can relate to that. Get up, move forward, get out. You're about to miss something here. I don't want you to miss that. And I'm not going to bang it into your life in something real loud. I'm going to whisper it in your ear because I don't want you to miss it. It's special. It's planned just for you. Just for you. And God doesn't want you to miss it. Well, Elijah had to trust God. You know, he didn't have any trouble trusting God when he went up against 450 prophets of Baal. But believe it or not, it was going to take a bigger trust here than it did there. He was going to have to trust him bigger. Sometimes we have to trust God bigger in the small things than we do the big things. And maybe that's where you're at today. Maybe there's something that God is just speaking to you about, something in your own life, and he's like, you've got to move away from that. You've got to move out of that. There's something I've planned for you that I don't want you to miss. But you've got to listen. And after listening, you just got to trust me. I can't do this for you. You've got to trust me. And it's taking that first step out of your cave, not Elijah's, your cave, and move forward. That's you deciding today, I'm not going to be stuck anymore. I'm tired of being stuck. I'm tired of spinning my wheels. I got to get out of here. Lord, thank you